Hi, welcome to Minimalism and Capitalism. This is Josh. In this episode, we're joined by organizers from Dare to Struggle, a multinational organization committed to struggling against all forms of domination. Throughout this conversation, we discuss some of their tactics deployed in response to the recent uptick in ICE raids happening nationally. We take a critical look at what has been effective and what is not, and the stakes for those who are daring to struggle against the deportation machine we are all up against. We also discuss the recent calls for a spring surge to melt ICE. Please check out the show notes to see how you can get involved and connected with the actions they are trying to spread nationally. If you like what we do and want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as little as $1 a month. We bring these conversations totally independently with no corporate stake or grant funding. Okay, so first of all, I would like to begin by allowing you all to introduce yourselves and maybe talk a bit about your organization and the type of work you're doing currently.
Cool. My name's Kenny from Dare to Struggle, New Mexico. And I'll tell you a little bit about the overview of Dare to Struggle, how it got started, what we're doing now, and then I'll let the others introduce themselves from their chapters. So over the last decade, powerful protests and rebellions on one hand and vicious cruelty of those in power on the other have laid bare the American nightmare that so many people are subjected to. Police brutality, the police murder of Black and oppressed people continue at epidemic proportions. Immigrants continue to be exploited in essential jobs, subjected to brutal detainment and deportation. American patriarchy continues on unfettered and is becoming more and more obvious. And the American empire rains down death and destruction over the world in the form of drone strikes and support for oppressive regimes. Dare to Struggle was kind of born from this. Even though there has been mass uprisings, pushback against the American nightmare in the form of reforms, grassroots mass organizing, and extreme large mass rebellions, we have yet to see changes. Things have continued and continue to progress, and people are still experiencing and feeling all of the horrors that this system has to offer. So Dare to Struggle kind of came about to be an answer to that. Yeah, our starting point for stopping any of these injustices must be to organize sustained and audacious resistance based among people under attack, and by uniting all who can be united. It's only when we dare to struggle that we can win victories and get a taste of our potential collective power. Yeah, so Dare to Struggle, its fundamental thing is going to the people who are experiencing the worst of this, finding local oppressors, and organizing people to confront them. And some of our areas of work include police brutality, and seeking justice for those murdered by the police. There's an organization called Families Demanding Justice that we'll get into, I'm sure, later in this podcast, that seeks to unite families who've lost loved ones and demand justice for them by calling for their killers to not only be fired, but be charged and put in jail. And then we have an area of work around homelessness in several areas around the country where we go to people who are formerly homeless or currently experiencing it and unite to call out local city officials, even the state, about the conditions that have become normalized and are accepted and even continue to be perpetrated by politicians favoring corporate interests and real estate developers over the people. And now, as we'll talk about, we're getting into work centered around ICE. So we'll be talking about the spring surge to melt ICE and the demands that we're leveling there with people across the country. I'm trying to think if I missed any areas of work. I feel like there's more, but I'm sure we can get into those later. Basically at Dare to Struggle, we're working for collective liberation, not by begging for more reforms or, by endorsing politicians. The stuff that's going on is because of people on both sides of the aisle in power right now. Yeah, we're also not seeking to make careers off of this, but we're interested in standing with the people who are experiencing the American nightmare, and yeah, building collective power.
Yeah, sure. I can go next. But yeah, I'm Ezzy, Dare to Struggle Chicago. I'm originally from California, actually. So I could have been Dare to Struggle SoCal or Bay Area, but I'm in Chicago. And yeah, I mean, really echoing some of the stuff that Kenny kind of laid down about, what Dare to Struggle is as an organization. It's like, we are an organization really open to anyone who wants to stand with people who are facing the worst of the system. Like Kenny mentioned, whether that's like families whose loved ones have been murdered by police, whether that's people who are homeless, whether that's people living in undignified housing, so living in slums and like taking advantage of and forced to pay rent while living in just inhumane conditions, whether that's like people like locked up, you know, behind bars, like in mass, like treated like animals, all the while like, exposing the kind of two-sided justice system under the system of, cops killed willy-nilly, steal lives and get away with it. And they're, while anybody else, especially Black, Latino people in this country, who do the same, are basically more or less, are met with like the full force of, the law under the system. And yeah, what we're fighting for is like to overthrow this system. So like, we believe that the way that people's, suffering ends is through a revolution against like what's currently oppressing them. And like we see in, the way that people like, the massive people, and by that meaning like the people who know what, oppression means firsthand, right? Like we saw that so explicitly in like, the 2010s and most recently, in 2020 of just like people openly rebelling, rising up against what at that had been just like decades, years of police just killing people and getting away with it. And like people took to the streets, people struck fear into the hearts of like those in power here by like, you know, by refusing to like yield anything less than, Derek Chauvin, the cop who murdered George Floyd, to be, charged and sent to prison where he is now. And to Kenny's point, that's the power and potential that people have in terms of their ability to transform society. And where we come in is like, how do we organize and like sustain that? How do we allow that energy to like carry us forward and accomplish bigger and bigger things until this entire system falls down? Because, as much as we take a leap forward, the people in power try to contain that leap, whether that's by diverting people's attentions towards, reform, whether that's also, capitalizing off of people's suffering by selling them false, promises. There's a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of organizations out there that like, their interests aren't in alignment with like actually seeing this shit stop and end, but in basically kind of carving out a piece of it for themselves. And that's at the expense of the people who are, are subjected to this system, are subjected to this nightmare. So, our responsibility is like, we want to see this shit end, and we want to like bring people forward who like want to see that too, to like step to the people who are oppressed and like tell them that there is a way forward, that we can fight this and we can fight it together. So
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have much to add. My name is Vlad. I'm from Dare to Struggle Austin. I think Kenny and Essie did an excellent job in describing Dare to Struggle in our work. Um, the only thing is like, yeah, everyone that is a member of Dare to Struggle is here because there's a deep care for the people, in that we're tired of seeing these injustices and this oppression keep going without any confrontation, any resistance to it that's strategic and organized, and able to genuinely confront it. As he mentioned, that we all feel like we have a responsibility to the people to go out there and struggle alongside them, and with them find out what the best next move is, refine our strategy together. We cannot be divorced from the people, and I think that shows clearly in our work.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. So shifting gears a little bit here, you guys wrote an article. What will it take to end the mass deportation machine? You guys offer some critical reflections on what you observed at the ICE Detention and Processing Center in Broadview, Illinois, in September of 2025. So I would love for you to meditate on some of these reflections with us today, if you're comfortable, of course. You point to, and I'm quoting here, a lack of clear leadership and strategic organization. End quote. So talk a bit about this moment revealing the limits of spontaneous protest and the kinds of organizational infrastructure that are actually necessary for movements to confront state power effectively. How do you imagine movements creating strategic coherence without defaulting to, rigid hierarchies?
Yeah, I can take that. So that's actually a piece that we are Dare to Struggle Chicago put out. We went to Broadview in September of last year, and basically we had went because that was kind of when things started to really escalate at Broadview, where basically the repression got very real, of chemical munitions being used on protesters, people being arrested, just at random, precisely just because the agents there could. But people kind of not backing down, right? People still kind of going fairly routinely to try to stop, shut down Broadview. That was the kind of objective, shut down its operations, stop the flow of, ICE vehicles from going in and out of the facility. And, in that piece, ironically enough, as we asked the question of what will it take to stop the deportation machine, the truth is we didn't actually at that moment in time, reflecting on it, didn't really provide a fully fleshed out answer to what that meant, right? Our assessments, were correct in the way that, you asked the question about kind of the spontaneity of this protest, of the kind of decentralized nature of it. Our assessment of that was correct. What we were finding there was no kind of strategy behind, people going to Broadview and even trying to reach what the goal of shutting down the facility was. It was people who meant well, who were honestly taking, the correct step of actually going to the facility itself, as opposed to, we have a lot of leftist organizations in Chicago, unfortunately, whether that's the FRIZOs or the PSOs or the our own Chicago Alliance of Racism and Political Repression that likes to worship our mayor, Brandon Johnson. And, in calling them out specifically is they do the very large, 1,000+ people protest downtown, that we saw also pop up in the wave of Midway Blitz and ICE, rolling through the streets. And but those 1,000 people weren't at Broadview, right? Those 1,000 people were downtown, away from confronting what people at Broadview correctly assessed as this is a deportation machine right here. This is the arm, this is the local apparatus of it here in Chicago and Illinois. This is where people are being detained after they're kidnapped off the street. And they're confronting them, and they were well-meaning. They were trying to willing and to put their bodies on the line to do that. And that's always going to be like supported and applauded and, you know, supported in that way. But it's the question of what we saw that night when we were there, and I was there with my another DTS member, was like we were outgunned, we were outnumbered, and we were in that scenario just pretty much outmatched. Like we left Broadview with just like sick with tear gas, bruised and battered, and hadn't accomplished what our goal was, which was to shut down the facility. And that's not to say that it's not a goal to have. It is an important goal to have, but it's like, well, this is where the lack of strategy and kind of the decentralized aspect of it. The next day, well, people came back and basically tried to do the same thing. And it's like, well, that's not really how, there's an importance of like summing up a situation and recognizing, well, what we're doing right now isn't enough and isn't working. And if our goal is to shut this facility down, then we need to take very seriously, like, if what we just did, like a crowd of maybe close to 100 people, if that, if what we just did didn't stop what was going on, then we need to do something else. And what we were trying to do with that piece was to kind of gear people in to try to get them to start considering, like, what is it actually going to take to stop the deportation machine? And like I said, we didn't really necessarily answer that. And, and we're picking up points of what we observed during that night, whether it's, and I think one of the ones to pull out is, our inability to rely on politicians to like kind of save us in this way, to stop the deportations, because they haven't, they aren't, But aside from that, a lot of what we were critiquing, honestly, was like the way in how people were protesting or how people were moving, which, doesn't necessarily lend itself to like answering the question of how to stop deportation. And I think like with, what we're doing now, like months later with the spring surge, to melt ice, like that's more of a proper way of answering this question, because from that night, our assessment was, well, we need mass resistance to this thing, not just in Chicago, not just in Illinois, like nationally. Like we gotta like stop. Like we gotta stop business as usual, like the status quo, and actually have like a mass of people in motion against and in confrontation with like this, the deportation apparatus, like these federal buildings, like, who are identifying who are enemies in terms of like politicians, whether on both sides of the aisle, recognizing what are our demands, like what are we demanding, and how are we trying to meet those demands, right? And devising that effectively to go into like move in a direction and like actually take people's well-meaning like energy and like put it into something that is really trying to contend with like this question and like stop the deportations. And I think like going back to kind of the critique of like, because I don't think like there's this sense of like organization, centralized leadership is somehow hierarchical or like leads to like rigidity, like all of us can speak to the sense of like really need to like move on demand and like respond to like what's happening on the ground, what the situation is. So like that rigidity is not something that we can actually like, that rigidity is not something that can actually hold up to like real life. But like there's a necessity for like centralized like leadership of these things, like people who are like making calls, people who are able to make decisions that are critical in moving people in a direction. And like if when you don't have that, and you don't have like that, bird's eye view and that look of, what direction are we actually going with? Are we becoming a threat to like the system? Are we going in the right direction? Like where do we need to correct ourselves? If you don't have that, then you can't see, you just keep doing the same thing, right? And I think we personally saw that in Chicago, because before Renee did, like we had Silverio Villegas Gonzalez. He was murdered by ICE on September 12th. Then we had Mar Martinez, who was shot like 5 times by the ICE in Brighton Park in October. She lived, she survived, right? But she got shot 5 times by a Border Patrol agent. And it's like what we understood and learned from that is basically like, we didn't have a strategy to like take that beyond Chicago, beyond Illinois. Like as much as those things made, they made national news, people were talking about them. People, we have to deal with our own situation of like kind of contending with how people respond, to these things, whether that's like I said, there's a very big contingent that like is very much like that looks to our mayor as like the way forward in terms of like resolving things with ICE. But we saw glimpses of people actually like rebelling, and like when Mar was shot, like people in Brighton Park came out into the street and like kicked ICE out. But it's like we couldn't rely on like that magically happening across Chicago or then like maybe across the country to say, okay, like, people are somehow going to wake up and like, we're going to stop this. We're going to stop the deportations. We're going to stop ICE. And, reflecting back on this piece and like the situation in Chicago with Silverio and Mar, it's like, we didn't have that. We didn't have a direction. We didn't have like where to take people from and like actually make this a problem. Like actually make what happened to Silverio, what happened to Mar like the end point. And ICE left Chicago and went to Minneapolis. And like, they murdered 2 more people. They murdered Renee Good, and that like was really a flashpoint for a lot of people. And it's like, instead of making the same mistake to say, this isn't the point of making a prolonged strategy to actually like keep people in motion and keep people in confrontation. We said like, no, we gotta, even with some initial hesitation on our part as an organization of, trying to figure out like, do we have like the actual like capability of like turning this into something? And it's like, those are the kind of struggles that we go through and trying to figure out and make shit happen in a way that like I said, like actually becomes a threat to the system, actually is trying to stop the deportations and will stop the deportations. But we said like, no, we're going to do this. And like, that's kind of where the Spring Surge came from, which was like trying to establish that like leadership on like a national level, not a local level, not even keeping it contained to Minneapolis, but like taking that and like going beyond and moving in a direction where it's like, our goal is to stop the deportations, and we believe in people. We believe in like the power of like mass resistance as a way of like doing just that. So, and yeah, that's that. I don't know if that answered your question in full, but I hope it did.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And I honestly, I appreciate the humility too, because I feel like a lot of organizations, including the ones that I've come in contact with in Chicago, right? It's just, there's this sense of, I don't know. I think there's something to be said about being both self-critical, but also critical of those around you, right? Including those not directly in your organization, right? And having an understanding that like, even if we don't know precisely what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, knowing that like what we've been doing is inadequate. That there's something about that that I find in deeply that I resonate deeply with, and I think that like it's something that I have not seen enough of us truly like in internalize and then interrogate in some way or another. So yeah, I do appreciate that.
Yeah. And I'll add real briefly too, and I agree with what you've laid out because it's important. Like, that's a really central aspect of like, reflecting on what we've done, like criticizing our shortcomings and like sharpening ourselves to like do shit better. Because it is like we're dealing with real people in their lives, and it's like
Absolutely, absolutely.
not something to play around with or like clout jock about, or whatever. And it's a difficult thing, because the other aspect that's really key is like, we need people like right now with the deportations, with ICE, it's like, we need to be struggling and figure out ways to bring like immigrants forward in this fight and like leading this fight, and not just us trying to fight for them, but actually like making a strategy that actually allows us to like support and bring them forward to like fight this alongside us. And like that's not an easy thing to try to do. That's not something that we take lightly. That's something that takes a lot of time and effort in trying to like figure out all the different like aspects of things. And if you're not if you're not humble, then like you're not, I wouldn't say you're taking this shit seriously enough, truly.
Mm-hmm.
This is about no one's ego. It's principally about like, how do we stop this? How do we stop this?
Definitely. So I don't know if you touched on this enough, but I would like for you to maybe just talk a bit about what this moment, right? Not just late 2025 in Chicago, but just generally speaking, right? Because we've seen this for honestly pretty incessantly for the last decade or so with the kind of like mass protest decade. Let's just talk about what this moment, right, revealed has about like how quickly a lack of a coordinated leadership can create openings for opportunists, and whether well-meaning or self-interested, to derail a kind of collective strategy. So how do movements and how have you guys been able to protect yourself, if at all, right, from individuals who step in at critical moments but don't understand or respect the technical needs at the moment?
Sure, I can take point. I would say that like the way that we protect ourselves, not only like the movement from people who may be well-meaning but are taking things in a direction that leads to just more reforms and in not well-meaning ways to like advance their own career in some way or to advance their organization, is by having this strong relationship with the masses and having them be at the forefront of everything, making decisions, talking about the situation, and working for a way forward with the people that are genuinely dealing with the things keeps us grounded in the actual material conditions that exist. Yeah, it's something that also requires a form of like central leadership in order to be able to tell when a movement is being led to like a reformist result. You have to have a bird's eye view, an understanding of the history of these movements, and be able to analyze the current conditions now and like struggle it out with the people who are suffering through this in order to keep us on the road to genuinely confront this, to genuinely overthrow this, and not just getting like a scrap of bread that they're willing to give out every once in a while. Like what we're hoping for is genuine liberation, and that comes through keeping the people that are suffering the horrors of this American nightmare at the forefront of the fight, struggling it out with them. Sometimes, there is a belief of doing it the legal way or doing it the right way, a quote unquote, of going and talking to your politician or your council member. And a lot of the people that we speak with have been taught that that's the only way to genuinely get out of their situation, that that's the only way to bring change in the world, when that's not true. And what we've seen is that in reality is the people who make the change. And what is needed at this point is for sort of leadership to come and focus the energy that we've seen spring out with all these mass protests into demands, into a focused road that can genuinely lead to an overthrow of the system, that leads people towards like confrontation with the powers that oppress them.
For sure. And I can add to what Vlad laid down well. And I think like, speaking about this moment is, from what we've seen, like even right now, right, things are still, hot and active, as I could say, right? But like there is a difference in the situation between like now being in February and what things are looking like in January. We had like 2 deaths, Renee Good, Alex Preddy in Minneapolis within like 2 weeks of each other. And just like other like just pretty abhorrent, other abhorrent like crimes by like ICE, in Minneapolis and other parts of the country. And it is a important moment. And I think that's the, moment is the way of like looking at it, or describing it, but it really has to be a kind of sustained and really like prolonged and organized like fight, right? Because one of the things that comes with like these kinds of moments, especially when this goes into the spontaneity aspect, it's like people are thrust into motion, into the streets, into political activity because like they're outraged and they're upset as to what they're viewing, what they're seeing. They're asking, for some of the right questions of like, why is this happening? What can we do to stop it? And there needs to be, answers to those questions. And those questions aren't going to get answered in like a day, or those things aren't going to get resolved in a day. And it's actually really bringing out like all like this as, this deportation apparatus. Like a lot of people are in motion because, this is the Trump administration's own like volley at what deportations are to look like, right? It's very in your face. It's hard to ignore. It's pretty violent and explicit, and it is brutal and it's awful. Like fuck Trump, like fuck him for real, right? But this is like, Trump didn't build the deportation machine. Like, he didn't build the facilities and the cages. Like, this is a bipartisan like deportation machine, and like we can't let people forget that, in the sense of if you're in motion now, right, you need to understand like who our enemies in this are, and like that's on both sides of both parties, basically, whether that's Democrats or Republicans. And there's gonna be people who are gonna be like, for example, like the reason why the feds are drawing back from Minneapolis is not because, Jacob Frey or Fry, I don't know how to say his name, or, Tim Walz did anything, right? It was because like people were in the street. People were not being confined to the usual business as usual of, okay, like we're going to let the politicians handle this, or this isn't our fight, whatever, like that, right? People were in the streets, in confrontation, even when they didn't necessarily like want to be in confrontation, but like the situation thrust them into it, right? Like Either they caught a stray tear gas canister or whatever, like they're in there. And right, like, but that's what led to, the withdrawal of the backing down of the Trump administration. And that's important, right? Especially in this moment as like, and it's important too, in that, like, we're seeing in the same way that we did in 2020, right? But in a different context, right? Because ICE needs to end, right? But those demands are coming from the streets. They're not coming from the heads of politicians, because that's not what they be thinking about. They don't be thinking about like actually like stopping people suffering, right? And those demands that they're parroting now to say, oh, we need to abolish ICE, or like we need to charge these killer ICE agents, like that's coming from the streets, that's coming from people. And in addition to the politicians, that's being taken up by, organizations that, like you mentioned here, but you are aware of in Chicago, it's like, that demand when it comes to police, like they're really scared of that demand for some reason. They don't like we're gonna jail killer cops. I guess it's too carceral or whatever, however you want to say it. But they're also taking up these calls in a way, right? They're trying to everyone's trying to grab at like what mass resistance did, whether that's the Democrats, whether that's these like nonprofit organizations, whatever. Everyone's recalibrating themselves to try to like win points in this moment. But what we have to like push forward in people, like through leadership and like prolonged struggle against like, both parties, like these other forces we're contending with that are trying to like, do, benefit in their own way from like mass resistance, is like we have to like mow all of those things down and like keep our eye on the prize of, we want to stop the deportations. And it's like, okay, now you've woken up to what this is. Maybe you didn't wake up to it when, Obama was deporting 3.1 million people in the dark. But this is what brought you forward. You saw Renee Good get shot in the face times, and you rightfully said that was fucked up. And like, what the fuck is this, right? And you want to do something about it. And it's like, okay, well, now you're in the struggle and you need to remain in that way. Now we need to be answering these questions for people as they come up, right? And even correcting, misdirections, who our enemies are. Like, this is a bipartisan deportation machine. No, politicians are not going to save us from this situation. Yes, like we actually have the potential to stop this. Like we've seen it in spontaneity, but we actually have to organize that and like turn that into a movement, where like people are like moving in a direction to stop what's happening. And yeah, I mean, that's in of itself like what the spring surge is try to turn a movement, into stopping the deportations, becoming a threat in a way that like we've put the people in power like on their back foot. Trump is trying to de-escalate things. Democrats are trying to de-escalate things, and it's like, well, actually, this is our time to actually like go harder and like not be wavered in any way of saying, the battle is done, because it's not, right? Like, people are still getting like kidnapped. People are still dying in detention in mass, right? Like, there's thousands of people in detention. There's immigrants in detention that are saying like free, like we want to be free. And so like that's a sign that's the fight isn't over. And what the spring surge is to say like to people who have that heart, are looking for like the way forward. It's to say like, well, this is a strategy of doing that. How can we bring broad segments of society, like, and principally like immigrants like in the forefront of like confronting the system. It's like, those are the kinds of questions that we're trying to answer and invite people to like contend with in a real way. It's not an easy way, because if it was easy, like we'd all be happy and like, we wouldn't be here. Dare to struggle wouldn't be a thing, right? But it comes from like, it emerged from like this nightmare that people are forced to like endure here and across the world. And it's like, we have to take that shit up and we have to struggle it out. And yeah, it's assessing the moment and seeing the moment, but recognizing that this is one episode in a longer struggle of that we need to undertake if we want to see this shit stop.
Yeah, I appreciate that explanation. So shifting gears here a little bit, I'm curious what kind of like long-term relationships have you guys been able to cultivate with the families, detainees, and people facing deportation that are necessary to build a movement that can sustain itself beyond, these like moments of crisis?
Yeah. Here in Austin, Dare to Struggle kind of took up the immigration work last year, and we met a family which we've been in contact since June, and we've been building our relationship with them and enjoying time together, having dinners, but also sitting down and talking politics about like the reason why we're there in the first place. There's a necessity to build trust, and in order to do that, we must genuinely become a part of people's lives, and then become a part of ours. Share, because like together in the struggle, um, we'll be able to figure out the way forward. And for a lot of families right now dealing with the terror that ICE is inflicting upon people who have been deemed illegal, there's a lot of fear, and so that trust is one that is incredibly important to show that we're here because we care. We're here because we think that you genuinely have the power to change your own situation, and we're there with you to figure out how it is that we're able to move forward in the collective struggle. It's been difficult here in Austin bringing this family forward politically due to this fear of like repression, fear of being targeted and having even worse things happen to them. But it's also like these families are already suffering enough, and this suffering has happened for decades. And why should we allow for this to continue and just suffer in silence? It's important to like bring the voice out to the streets and collectivize it. There's also been a lot of work with families who have lost loved ones to them being murdered by police. Families Demanding Justice is an organization that came to fruition through like connecting families that we've met who have suffered this injustice and bringing them together and collectivizing their experience. And through that work was where FDJ, Families Demanding Justice and Dare to Struggle, came to the demand of jailing killer cops. That was what most of the families really wanted and sought for as justice, not just like a paycheck. That was what genuinely would help them. And so that became a core demand in Families Demanding Justice. I know Chicago has a strong relationship with Charlotta Pritchett, one of the leaders in Families Demanding Justice, whose partner Timothy Glaze was murdered by CPD. I'm not sure, Ezzy, if you want to speak to how that relationship came to be and maybe how she came forward in the fight against police brutality.
Yeah. No, it's like kind of a lot of to what Vlad has already said. It's like, it's about like building like genuine relationships with like, with people, it's like, you know, people are really like precious to us. We care really deeply for them. And, with like Charlotta specifically, like, we met her probably like 4 days after Timothy was murdered, right in front of her front door. Like she lives in an apartment complex, a senior apartment complex. And, Timothy was having a mental health crisis and he was shot 16 times by Chicago police and died right there in front of her door. And, at first, a lot of it was just like showing up, right? Like telling her that we were there, we wanted to fight with her, but also having a level of patience, recognizing just the immense loss and the, cycle of emotions that she was experiencing, and just keep showing up for her, right? Like going over to her house, like spending time with her, sharing in her memories and recollections of Timothy and the happy times that they had together, learning more about her as a person, beyond like what happened to Timothy, just her life and all the things that she's gone through and overcome. And yeah, like, but still having those conversations and those natural like political conversations that stem from this like sitting down with somebody who, you know, who has maybe for their first time, like with Charlotta, like this is the first time that, I mean, she didn't expect this to happen to her. No one does, right? She didn't really have a problem with police before Timothy got killed. And then has since then, if you asked her, she'd say like, wow, like, if it hadn't been for this, I wouldn't have, I watch the news, I see it, I stopped watching the news because I don't want to keep seeing it. And then maybe you kind of just like ignore it from there. But, she was right here experiencing it. Her partner like was murdered. And, those conversations come up and it was just like, well, it's always a question of like, well, what do you want to do? Like, what do you want to see happen? And, those are the questions that we asked. You're like, what do you want to do and see happens with Timothy's murder? And like, for her, it was like she wanted principally, like before we even met her, like her call was like, I want to see the officers who murdered my partner locked up. Like, I want them off the streets. And, and from there it was just like, well, how do we make that happen? Like, how do we fight to see that happen? And since then, it's just been, kind of a combination of, like working with her, and other families too that we've met along the way of, and, to really just like strategize and like figure out like how to, again, build that mass resistance to like police brutality that we need to like stop it. Right. And it's a struggle. It truly is. I think, I don't know what it feels like to have my loved one murdered by police. And that's a very important thing to note because it's an uphill battle. There's good days, there's bad days, and that's also a struggle, right? We want to be there. There's an isolating aspect of things that like, naturally, especially like we're under the system, like, it's like there's a sense of, not wanting to burden each other or not feeling like anybody can really understand what you're going through, even when they're kind of experiencing similar things. It's really easy to just isolate yourself, right? And that's kind of a culture that can happen, even when it's fun as positive, like the self-care stuff, you just kind of like disappear, like easy to cut people off and all of that stuff. And it's like that happens. Like that's something to contend with even like amongst families as well. And it's like struggling out. It's like, okay, like we have strength in numbers, how do we show up for each other fully, whether that's a shoulder to cry on, whether that's somebody to go walk the dog with you, whatever, watch your kids. Like, well, the question is like, how do we, you know, stay united and stay in the struggle? Because the struggle is an important one. We don't want to see any more families like join our collectivity. Like we want to see this, we want to see this. We don't want to see people continue to get killed by police. So it's a lot of, struggle in that way of like figuring out how to kind of break some of those like habits and tendencies with people of, how can we like how and trying to consistently answer that question of like how can we like stay in this fight? How can we like support one another in doing that? And like then it's like, okay, what does that fight look like? How are we raising our demands? How are we bringing more people around families? How are we, how are we confronting like those responsible from, the pigs themselves to the politicians that protect them to, the nonprofits that play keep away with them. So you're not trying to confront them. So it's like contending with all of those things. And it's principally just goes with a lot of like trust and like love and, compassion and, through all of that, like that's what and study too of like what are we, what is the system that we're facing, what is police brutality and like why is it that, as Charlotta always asks, like why is it that cops can get away with killing people, right? Analyzing that and like, studying together and figuring like answering those kinds of questions with her that come up and that come up for a lot of families. It's like Charlotte also say, it just doesn't make any sense to her. Like why this, and it's true, it doesn't make any sense. But let's like sit down and talk about it. Let's try to like figure that stuff out. And like that is honestly proven to like, have brought her forward as like, really powerful leader in the fight against police brutality, not only just for Timothy, right? But also like every family, all our families in FDJ and like, all stolen lives. Like that's who Charlotta is fighting for. Because she recognizes that like, this police brutality has to end. Like these killer cops need to be held accountable. And she, as somebody whose loved one was murdered, who knows what that feels like, who knows the deep burning desire to see this, no other family go through this, is in the best position and to lead it. And she's taking that up with our support.
Yeah, I think I'll add a little bit about Spring Surge and the point of it, to the point that Ezzy and Vlad were making about like developing relationships, and those are absolutely essential for a movement continuing, and taking guidance and taking tips from the people who are directly experiencing this, and like really cultivating that trust that is necessary for people to kind of like dive into struggle, like knowing that they have people around them who like are going to be right next to them in that fight. With Spring Surge, like it is an invitation for people who have, like gas for this right now, people who are like in the street, people who are like rightfully super angry about what is going on. It's an invitation for them to like start developing these relationships with people. Like a lot of us spend a lot of our time like going door to door, like reaching out to people very specifically and getting to know people and like stepping to them with like love and care and support and politics. And yeah, like figuring out like what will it take with these people who are upset about the current conditions, like what will it take for them to really like be able to like step into their own as like leaders of this movement. And so, yeah, like inviting people to like go out with the demands of Spring Surge, which is to free all the kidnapped. That doesn't mean like make detention centers like more comfortable or like soften how ICE is detaining people and the ways that they're doing it. Or even like just taking their masks off. Like that's not what it is. It's like it's open the detention facilities and release everybody. And the other demand is to stop the detentions, to stop the deportations, excuse me. And that once again doesn't mean like softening it and taking it out of the news because it's not as brutally violent like, like under the Obama administration, not glazing over it. It means stopping this altogether. And then another one is to jail the killer ICE agents and like jail the brutal ICE agents who've like assaulted people and charge them. Yeah, and taking those demands out to people over the course of the springtime, in order to like bring people in and bring people up as leaders. And there's several steps of the spring surge. The first one was these school walkouts, in which students, over about 2,000 students from across the country, 64 different schools, walked out, raising up these demands against ICE, against the deportation machine, in tandem with the knowledge that, there's students all across the country walking out for this very same thing. And the next thing that we will be hosting is a forum on fighting repression, because as Vlad mentioned, and as we hear a lot when we're getting to know people, is that there's a real fear of political and like violent physical repression. And so we hope to like answer some of these questions with that. As Dare to Struggle, we have, faced charges and fought them, and they have been dropped in some cases. And other types of, political repression, we think it's like fundamental to like address it head on and not let ourselves like be benched. And we think that's like a really important example to show to people we're hoping to bring up as leaders of like, if, when something happens, there is like a national collectivity behind you to like back you up. And so, with these forums on how to fight political repression and win, we're also calling on like lawyers to join the fight, ones who aren't going to just press people to take plea deals, but instead challenge like the validity of these charges in the first place. Like, it is right to rebel against ICE. It's right to rebel against police brutality, and have, just the knowledge that like if something like does happen, if repression is faced, like it will further the movement itself, and it'll play like an active role in discrediting the system that, has its boot on the backs of many people in this country, and can become like an actual tool for fighting this battle. And then the next thing in the spring surge is going to be speak outs. It's what we call them. It's where we invite people to like get on the mic and speak bitterness about the situation. And so, we're going to be inviting people to like go out to places where, there are immigrants, like develop those relationships, encourage people to get on the mic. I know for me, we've had a lot of people who, were initially hesitant, and then they get up on the megaphone and then they're just like laying it down and they're fired up. And afterwards they're like, that was great. I needed to do that. Really calling for that. And then the next thing after that is going to be people's tribunals, where if we can't get meaningful justice from the politicians or the justice system, we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to be inviting people out to convict the people responsible for ICE terrorism in this country, and convict the murderers. People's tribunals. And then the final thing that we'll end with is celebrations of like immigrant culture and resistance. And in that way, like kind of speaking to what Vlad and Ezzy are talking about, is like the isolation that comes with living in this country and like facing like a hard thing, and especially being fearful to like even step outside, hoping to like break that isolation and bring people together to celebrate. So for this entire spring, gathering people, raising people up as leaders, so we can come out even stronger with the movement in the summer, and like not lose the like Democrats are trying to take the wind out of the sails of this movement right now, of this like mass sentiment of righteous anger against ICE and the deportation machine. And we want to add wind to those sails and bring more people in. So that's kind of the point of that.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can talk a little bit more about how, like, what precisely you want folks to do to support as well, and to be brought in, if that makes sense.
So on our next step being the forums against political repression, we're asking students that we have been in contact with for the walkouts on February 13th to host their own, and we're going to be hosting our own forums, bringing people to a conversation to talk about what it is that happened, what the repression has looked like across the country. It's had various faces. Here in Texas, students have had even local cops show up at their door, accusing them of domestic terrorism, scaring them, trying to get them to not walk out, trying to get them to not like use their voice. And that's something that we're taking very seriously, and we should like discuss and bring in the people that are interested and currently have this fire for the situation that is going on into these conversations, to make sure that we have a strategy on how to fight against this political repression and genuinely win. Whenever people stand up and fight against these kinds of forces, repression is inevitable. And so in order to have a sustained movement, we must take it very seriously at every step of the way and collectively fight back against it. If people are interested in hosting forums in the location where they're at, you can hit us up. We have a contact page on our website, or you can DM our Instagram accounts. For the neighborhood speakouts and these public tribunals, it's important for people to go out to the masses, go out to the people, the immigrants, and speak with them about the situation, and together work towards conducting one of these speakouts, these events where immigrants can speak bitterness and collectivize that situation, trying to get people out of the isolatory nature of the terror that ICE is bringing to them, and in that way we can like solidify and build our movement.
Yeah, and I'll also add, if people are interested, hit us up, as Vlad said. Do all of these things at daretostruggle.org. You can find a toolkit with like flyers, posters, and like a step-by-step guide on how to put each of these events on and like what to do. But like definitely reach out to us. I mean, we're like here to support. We want to see people like take on this work. We also have a GoFundMe account. As you can imagine, it gets pretty pricey printing all these posters and fighting all this repression, and just to carry it on in general. So yeah, you can find your GoFundMe also on the daretostruggle.org.
And I'll add briefly too, like, repression really is like one of the really like key things that hold a lot of people back in the face of, going up against the system. It's like, there's no way of sugarcoating it. Like when you do like confront the system, like in a way that actually like, threatens the interests of those in power, like, well, you're gonna get repressed. And then there's already like people who are already repressed, like whose lives are pretty much like limited in so many ways, facing so many different types of oppression, from the police, from, jails and prisons, from like, the system itself. And just, it's like, and recognizing that, and like really like, and so like principally like these forums are really to contend with like the fact that like if we do want the deportations to end, if we want to like overthrow the system, like we have to have a force behind us that's going to withstand anything that they try to throw at us, and that looks like that's on like within the courtroom, right? You know, and also principally like outside of the courtroom, because you also know that like the battle can't just stay in the courtroom. Like, we're not going to rely on like just the support of law to actually like get justice for people. That's not what it does. But that is not to say that we can't wrench that victory out of it by, like Kenny said, like making the state, the government like prove its burden of proof that like, and try to, charge or convict, people for rebelling against the system. We can force that hand, and like, that means like getting, lawyers involved and like people who actually want to take that principled stand. And, but that also means like, taking these stories out to people, right? Taking stories of like Mara Martinez out, letting people know that like, I mean, she basically faced the closest thing to death. Like, she was shot 5 times and she's still here and she's still fighting, right? Like, she got her charges dropped. They try to charge her with, disrupting of federal operations, a charge that would have seen her do 20 years in federal prison. And she was like, I know what the truth was. Like, I was attacked while trying to defend my neighborhood from ICE. And she got her charges dropped, right? She forced the system to prove its burden, and they like laughably failed at that. But now she's going on the offensive. And I think that's the key. It's like when we face repression, the point is to win, but then strike back hard against the system for daring to even try to like, repress us. And that means like, yeah, like seeing your cases through. That means like taking these cases out to people, letting people know what's going on. That means also struggling with like the fear, right? It's like, there is no safe protest truly, right? Like at any point in time, like the police could be like, okay, we're going all in on these people. And like nonviolence oftentimes is, you see that a lot, like even right now, like even in the face of like you're staring down like a rubber bullet, and it's like, I've seen a lot of it, and don't give Trump what he wants, and like stay peaceful. But there really isn't anything like there's not really anything as a like that peace is contingent on like the enemy deciding, okay, they're not gonna fuck with you this day. And that peace, if you're self-policing yourself, if you're constraining yourself, is also at the price of the threat that you're trying to become to the system. Like, if you don't want to be a threat, then like, well, then what are you actually fighting? What do you actually hope to accomplish if you're not trying to become a threat, which makes you a target naturally, right? And we have to become a threat if we want to stop this shit. So it's like, okay, like, well, how can we build that like mass support, whether it's like lawyers, like people following these cases, people like protesting on behalf of these cases, people in motion in some way, donating to fund, legal expenses and so on and so forth. Like people taking up principally that it is right to rebel against the system. It's the right to rebel against ICE and deportation. It's right to rebel against any form of repression. And like, we are going to stand with people who are. And that's like taking that out. That's what, some like this forum is like trying to build out, because that's going to be the principal thing that will contend. As we go harder against the system, it will go harder on us. So we are trying to build that out in a way that like allows people to see that like you can fight repression and win. And like, we don't have to be afraid of the system. Like, we have strength in numbers. And like, the more people we see, the more that example is set that you can win and fight, like you can beat repression, and like you can actually go harder against the system. Like, the more people we hope to like bring forward to see that like they don't have to be afraid. Like, they can take up this fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something you kind of gesture at in this piece. The title "Dispatches from the Battle of LA," right? Which was in response to Trump deploying agents from numerous federal agencies, of course, to the streets of LA. And but something that you guys saw was you describe a cross split between spectators and people willing to confront federal agents, right? And I wanted so the question is actually technically two questions about this observation that you described in the piece. One being, how do movements encourage people to move from observation to meaningful participation, especially while understanding the stakes of confrontation with a ruthlessly predatory state, of course, right? But also, you make note of how a lot of people, in the heat of the moment, abandoned the protesters once the police declared an unlawful assembly, which left people, namely the youth, who were already out-militarized and outnumbered, vulnerable to captivity and maiming or worse, right? And so I'm thinking about this just in the terms of like the kind of like limits of certain activist formations, right? When confronted with real state pressure, right? Which is, I think it's an antagonism, right? That I feel like keeps emerging. I've seen so many scenarios like this, and I know I don't want to call out any specific organizations, right? But like, like it happens, right? And we see kind of these kind of clashes between the more willing and able militant organizations versus those who kind of just like you wanted, or even just individuals, I mean, just organizations themselves, even just individuals who kind of just come up to these demonstrations and want to show their support, versus, and that kind of like, there's always a disconnect, so I'm curious if you guys have any, further thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can take a stab, and Vlad and Kenny are welcome to hop in. I think there's a point of saying like, not everyone's going to be on like the front lines of something, right? Of, the struggle against like the system, for sure. Like, in terms of being, right at the front of a line of fire of like, riot police or something like that, right? But that's also not to say that like everyone is like, what people do is, I think a lot of it goes back to like, what are we trying to accomplish? We want the deportation to stop. The system has to be overthrown, like, for this, there's people suffering to end. And it's like, how are people contributing to that goal? Because I think some of the things that you're raising about, like, we have antagonism with, people who don't actually want to confront like the system, like don't actually want to like see like, there's people suffering, and like they show themselves in these moments of, abandonment, right? Because I think that's less of a question of um of like fear, as opposed to like leadership in those instances. When we see like these organizations like fail when shit gets hot, right? When people are ready to like confront like, the enemy before them, and instead of taking a stand with them, like they hightail it and leave. And I think that boils down to like, well, what are they trying to actually accomplish, right? what are they trying to what are they trying to achieve? And if it's anything short of like seeing this stop and like reading the situation and seeing people who are ready to take step forward and like be on the front lines and abandoning them, then that's like those, those organizations, those entities like aren't actually trying to like see this shit stop. And, they become like the enemy in that way of getting in the way. Because like, what will people now see? People will now see like, well, people like those people, those kids, right? Which is, why those interventions that our LA chapter are able to make, it's not to say that there wasn't, again, it's like you're outmatched and outgunned, right? There's no question about that. But it's like, what would have been the difference had those like youth tried to take a stand and realize and honestly in those moments like achieve victories, like, sending the police packing for one instance, right? Catching the police off guard because they thought like if they show up, in their riot gear that the people were going to back down and, disperse. And that didn't happen, right? And that showed people their power. Like that was a taste of their power. And that's what this sense of like, if people are like pushing, but both like reading the situation of where people are at and like also trying to push them into confrontation in this way is to show them that they don't have to be afraid and that they have power, right? But also standing shoulder to shoulder with them and like confronting what you're confronting. Because then it's like if you abandon those people and it's like, well, they get wailed on, and it's like, well, the initiative they took to take the step forward and try to like stand their ground, is now going to be met with a lot of regret, a lot of, well, this was pointless. Why did I do this? And, there's no object, there's no, nothing's like, it can quickly descend to nihilism in that way of just, this isn't going to work. Or like, maybe I made a mistake and this was the wrong thing to do. When it was the right thing to do, we're trying to encourage those things and like build them up in a way that brings those people forward as like into, a higher level of thinking beyond, those individual like militant confrontations, but then seeing what they're doing as the start of a actual like longer term struggle against the system, right? And like that's what making those interventions and like standing with people and standing your ground against the system is really important, because it can show people that like you can take a stand. And there's not going to be victories in every confrontation with like, with ICE, with the pigs, with whoever, right? There's not going to be victories in every confrontation. There will be like bruises and there will be repression for sure. But it's like those instances where you see people, on the front lines, like taking that initiative, or things that like are important things to encourage and things to like channel into strategy into, okay, like you've taken this step forward. Now what's next? Like, what's our strategy? How are we trying to accomplish, what our goal is? If we want the deportations to stop, okay, well, now we're going to, now here's a strategy laid forth before you. Like, can you take this up? Right? Can you, do this? And, for those like, because I want to avoid saying like, everyone can do something, because I think it boils down to the strategy. Because if I'm saying like that can easily devolve itself into like, really kind of be very locally orientated, being very also like not confrontational with the system, but like, well-meaning in their ways of like we take care of each other, local bottom up, like, I can walk my immigrant neighbor to the bus stop to make sure that they're okay and like they don't get nabbed. I can deliver groceries to my neighbor so they don't have to leave their house. But then again, it's the same forces that were on the front line at that protest are the same forces that could break down that person's door or could be right there next to you and nab your neighbor and your friend, whether you want to confront that or not. And I think like not confronting it and trying to do as well meaning as you can of, keeping yourself away from, the reality of like the system and what it's capable of when it can go after people. What that ends up doing is it creates another obstacle of actually trying to take up, fighting the system like head on. And it's like, if you don't want to be at the front lines of a protest, well, support those who are, right? Don't treat your immigrant like neighbor or like your as some passive, individual that doesn't have thoughts about what's happening and may also be wondering how to stop what's going on, right? Like those are questions that have to be like taken up and asked of people. And like, and that requires like, struggling things out, like building that infrastructure to, withstand repression, to think about things on a higher level of, how do we move people against, local forms of oppression and use that as a way of giving people a taste of what they're capable of and like scale that up on higher and higher levels, right? It's like, if you're seeing like your local politician is saying a lot of words, but like ICE is still around, that's someone to confront. That's not the same as confronting ICE itself, but like that's also confronting a part of the problem, which is these politicians aren't doing anything to stop ICE, but they're making people think that, they are, right? That's something to expose and confront. So there's different ways of confronting the system that isn't, confronting like the militant or the police force apparatus of it. There's politicians, there's other forces in society that are also equally invested in like maintaining the status quo that can also be confronted. And I think it just boils down to like, what are we trying to achieve, and like making people's actions a reflection of like, and feeding into that goal of, and serving feeding into that goal and serving the role, whatever roles are necessary for that.
Yeah, and to add on to that, there's also like a necessity to lead by example. Sometimes people need that push to go out there and join up with the rebels. And that's something that we see important. That's why we make certain interventions whenever organizations leave people when shit gets hot. For example, during our conference in June of last year, we stopped an entire day, decided to cancel the events that we had planned, and as a national organization went out to provide leadership to a protest whose organizers had just abandoned. There was like hundreds of people out in the street, and we were able to go in and bring people to confront their oppressors head on, rather than it just being like a rally or a parade who wasn't unified around like genuinely bringing this shit to the people that are oppressing us. we were able to channel that energy and bring people to the doorstep of our oppressors. And there was a lot of mistakes that we made during the day that impeded our ability to maybe even take it a bit further than that, seeing as to how many people were out there. But we saw it as important to, even though it was something of a ad hoc decision, it was important for us to be out there and provide leadership in that way, in order to not allow this fire that had been raging in LA to die off due to this nihilism that Ezzy points to, that can come from being out and protesting, and then realizing that or being taught the lesson that actually this doesn't do anything, as we have seen a lot of people internalize through what happened with the co-opting of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, where there was this mass rebellion that took the streets and ended up going into reforms that haven't done anything. And in fact, things are only worse since then, with more killings every year. And so that comes from these movements not having confrontation of the state, confrontation of with the oppressors as a main goal, because that is genuinely the only way that we're able to make change. And leading by example is something that we find helps. I've been in situations where just stepping forward a little bit with me and some of our team can lead to a whole crowd being emboldened and step forward themselves. And so if there's an opportunity to do so, it's one that we should encourage and support, and build out this infrastructure to be able to support it further than just on the ground. Whenever repression happens, we can be there with those that are willing to confront the state and suffer the consequences of it, support them, and with that also bring in more people into the fight, as now this is a national movement. This is something that has support across the nation, not just a local isolated protest, who if people feel the energy to want to genuinely confront things and face repression, aren't able to genuinely fight back due to it being isolated. Now there's a connected national network to be able to support that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, there are some people who are moved at the moment to be on the front lines, who are, have righteous anger and want to act on that and recognize that the stakes are high. They've been high for a while. Some people are just being brought into, this struggle against ICE more recently. They've been mobilized and are starting to have understood very deeply that ending what's happening here, stopping the deportations, freeing the kidnapped, it will come at the price of our own comfort. And I think people are more and more beginning to reckon with that. And yeah, as you mentioned before, some people aren't able to be out there on the front lines, but supporting people who have faced political repression on the front lines, doing what is just and moral, and rebelling against the system that perpetrates this violence on people all throughout this country and the rest of the world. People supporting them, and then people who are able but maybe not so willing. Our challenge to them is maybe consider, really sitting with what level of discomfort do you think you need to be more comfortable with in order to get these demands met, to end the oppression that is happening with ICE in this country. And obviously, like, we invite those people to, attend the forums and like talk further and like really think through these things that are very serious. Yeah. And yeah, for the organizations like PSL and Frizzo and 5051, the Democrats who abandon their protests when they get hot, like, our question to them really is like, what is your goal? As he was saying, like, what is your goal? Is it to, like, are you comfortable with the status quo? Are you okay with that? What is the goal of your protest? Is it to get more members and simply be like a pressure valve for the masses of people who are angry right now? Do you see them as like just potential members of your organization to like make your protest in a park even bigger? Or do you see these people as the makers of history? And if you're policing them from making history, then yeah, really like take an analysis of what you're doing. And yeah, if you're all talk about, wanting to see an end to this, like wanting to bring around like socialism or get rid of, the current president or whatever, and then you back down as soon as there's like an opportunity to do more, then yeah, just like have a parade, then maybe you should like change what you're saying to people, and maybe you should say, oh, this is going to be a parade, so that people can take stock of that and make their own choices about what they think is necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was great. But before I let you go, I would like to give you the opportunity to tell folks where they can find you. And yeah, just anything you want to add before, we hop off here.
Yeah, for sure. Like Vlad mentioned earlier, like we have a website. We have a website page that's fully dedicated to the spring surge to melt ice. It's daretostruggle.org. Is it / or is it /? Which one is it?
I think it's forward.
/melt ice, right? Is that right?
Yeah, / melt ice, MELTICE.
Yes. And that has all the information regarding like the different components of the surge, beginning from walkouts all the way to the cultural resistance celebrations, resources for people who want to take this up wherever they are in terms of directions, flyers, posters, of course, the ability to contact us directly and reach out to, brainstorm specifically for forums. Like we're putting a call out for people who want to organize forums to hop on a call with us, and they can do that by DMing the like Dare to Struggle National on Instagram, and someone will follow up with them to reach out about organizing forums. But then that applies to all aspects of the surge. Like we have our like respective chapters in different places. You can't miss us. We're all Dare to Struggle insert location. So Dare to Struggle Chicago, Dare to Struggle Mexico, Dare to Struggle Austin. Newest edition is Dare to Struggle Fort Worth, Dare to Struggle SoCal, Bay Area, Dare to Struggle Connecticut, New York, and more, for people who want to take up this, this work and start a chapter in their respective locations. We are also we're all taking up the surge wherever we are locally, and invite people to like pull up, in person, to these events, or reach out to us as well. If they want guidance, if they need assistance, if they have, if they've taken this up and they have suggestions, criticism, things that we be doing better, or things that we aren't aware of and they want to make us aware of, like, we welcome all of those things in really advancing this push. And like Kenny mentioned, of, raising our demands of freeing all of the detained, stopping the deportations, and jailing the killer ICE cops responsible for the deaths. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Well, this is great. I appreciate you so much, all three of you, for coming on and talking with us today. I think it's going to give a lot of folks a lot of, just seeing, hearing a lot about what you guys have been actually struggling against lives recently. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having us on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Great.